Hello everyone, I'm Reza Red, and today, as part of Ignite 2018 interviews, we are interviewing Matthew Roche as part of Power BI CAT team and talking about data flows and sorts. Can you introduce yourself?
Oh, absolutely. So, hey everyone, my name is Matthew Roche. I'm a program manager on the Power BI team at Microsoft. I've been with Microsoft for about 10 years, worked on Power BI, Azure Data Catalog, SQL Server Integration Services, Data Quality Services, and Master Data Services. So sort of ran the gamut of a lot of the information management and BI tools at Microsoft over the years. And before I joined Microsoft, I was a SQL Server MVP, similar to Reza's role now, and had a focus on integration services, data warehousing, and BI.
Awesome, thank you. And you do a lot of sort activities as well. How do you find that beside Power BI?
Yeah, I do indeed. So I am almost 50 years old, so I'm not a young man anymore, and finding ways to stay active and to stay fit and to not be bored is kind of a challenge. Around 4 years ago, I discovered that there's a thing called Historical European Martial Arts, or HEMA as it's sometimes known, where people, over the last century or so, they have rediscovered these medieval fight books, so literally technical training manuals on how to fight with a sword or a spear or a dagger, other weapons, and they've translated them into modern languages, and a lot of them were martial artists, doing karate or other Eastern martial arts. So they basically said, we know how to fight. We know these living traditions. Let's take these historical documents and apply them. And there is this beautiful worldwide community where a lot of these historical martial arts are applied as full contact combat sports. So you're using steel weapons, but they're blunted and relatively flexible so that injuries tend not to be severe. You'll almost always come away with a bruise, but it's rare to break anything. And it's the most fun. It's kind of like being on stage at a conference where you're always scared before you walk out there, but it's a great adrenaline rush, and it's very, very, very rewarding.
That's interesting. That's very interesting. I'll get one of your sort, let's say, fighting. What do you call it? Sort fighting or sort not playing? Of course.
So yeah, well, there's lots of different terms. So sword fighting certainly fits. Historical fencing is probably my favorite term because fencing is just fighting with weapons. Modern fencing or sport fencing has been refined over centuries, so there's very little martial in it. You can't hurt someone that way, or it's hard to do so. So this is fencing in a more historical style.
Nice. I'll get one of your photos probably to put beside this video. That's awesome. Thank you.
That sounds more than fair.
So my understanding is that your area, you have done a lot of work with all different areas of Power BI, but my understanding is that you have done some work in Dataflows mainly.
Yep. So for full disclosure, I probably am the least expert Power BI person on the Power BI team. So I've played as a user with a lot of capabilities, but I certainly don't consider myself an expert on Power BI in any way. But I have been doing a lot of work on the upcoming Dataflows capability, and honestly, this is what has me most excited.
Yes.
My career background, in the years before I joined Microsoft, I was a data warehousing and ETL consultant for many years, and before joining the Power BI team, I've worked on a lot of capabilities in the Microsoft data platform that are related to ETL, data preparation, data quality, and data governance, and having these capabilities coming into Power BI is very, very exciting, and for me, it's sort of the sweet spot, both in terms of the functionality and the problem domain that it's addressing.
Yes, yeah, that's correct. That's absolutely right. And you have a session on Dataflow as well.
Yep.
Is it today, tomorrow?
Yeah, so I have a total of 3 sessions, and I was actually looking in the event calendar earlier just to make sure that I knew where they were. So tomorrow I am co-presenting with Miguel Lopez both the one breakout session, which is the BRK 2061, which is tomorrow afternoon. We've got just over 600 people registered for that session right now, so I'm super excited about how much interest there is. And we also have 2 technical workshop sessions, which are a different format. They're capped at 60 people because that's the size of the room, where Miguel and I are going a little bit deeper and a little bit more interactive. It's not going to be the instructor-led lab format that some of the technical workshops are, but the breakout session is limited to 45 minutes, so a very, very tight window to cover such an exciting and big new feature. The 75 minutes for the technical workshop is going to give us a little bit more flexibility to slow down and go a bit deeper.
Yeah, I see. Yeah.
And one of so we have the technical workshop tomorrow morning and then a repeat on Thursday as well.
Yeah, I've seen the repeat session in the agenda list as well. That's nice.
Yeah.
So coming to Dataflow, let's talk about that a little bit more in details. A lot of people who worked with Power Query are asking, well, is Dataflow is just Power Query in cloud, or it gives us some extra features as well?
So let me answer in a few different ways. So from a familiarity perspective, yes, it is Power Query in the cloud. And by that, I mean that there is a Power Query experience built into the browser. So when you go to powerbi.com, there are options to create new data flows. It's a new object type in your workspace, similar to a data set or a report or a dashboard. And you create it in the browser at powerbi.com. And there is a web-based or HTML-based Power Query editor where you can both graphically build your query and if you already have an existing query that you built in Power BI Desktop, you can just copy your M code and paste it in. So from a simplicity and familiarity perspective, yes, it's Power Query in the cloud, but the context is fundamentally different. When you think about Power Query as we've used it to date, your Power Query queries, that function or set of functions that defines the shape of your data table in your data set, it's really all about transforming data and loading it directly into your analytics model. So, it's your destination is always part of your tabular model, and the opportunities for reuse are very limited. When you're using Dataflows, even though the query that you're building is another Power Query, so it's the same technology and the same connectivity stack, the destination is a Dataflow entity, which is a reusable table inside your Power BI workspace that is backed by Azure Data Lake storage behind the scenes that is designed to be a reusable data source across multiple Power BI and other solutions. One of the most common questions that I hear is, because data flows are part of a workspace, they are contained inside a workspace like a data set would be, can I use that data in other workspaces? And this is really, and the answer is yes. And this is really the key scenario is all about reusing that data. If you think about a data flow and the entities that it contains as a logical data warehouse, they fill that same architectural position as a data lake or data mart or data warehouse, where you've extracted the data from a source, but you might be staging it, you might be cleansing it, you might be preparing it, you might be standardizing it, but you still need to use it in more ways and more places. This is what a data flow allows you to do. the data flow and the entities that it contains can be shared with other users and can serve as that intermediary step that is so important in an end-to-end BI application. And because it's managed by the Power BI service, it just shows up magically in Power BI desktop and in the service. So it's super easy to use, it's strongly typed, it's easily discoverable. But the focus and the difference between Power Query for data flows and Power Query for the traditional BI use cases or Power BI use cases is that data flows are logically like a data warehouse, and they are designed specifically for reuse.
That's great. That's great explanation. So based on your explanation, I can create a data flow bringing, let's say, bringing my customer table from somewhere and bringing my product table from another place. And I can use this in this Power BI file, and I can use it in many other Power BI files as well, because this is like all located in my central data warehouse, which is stored somewhere in data lake, correct?
Yep, you're exactly correct, and I think a key thing is that like any data preparation or data warehousing tool, it's all about getting the data from where it currently lives, so its current location, its current shape, its current context, and putting it into a different location and often a different shape and different context so that it can be used for a different purpose. If you think about data warehousing in general, the reason that we have data warehouses as part of our end-to-end BI solutions is because this pattern solves a set of well-known common problems. So it allows us to stage, to standardize, to clean, to have the single view of the data for analytics purposes that may come from one source system, but typically comes from many source systems. So the data warehouse is part of that pipeline. Traditionally, even in Power BI today, even though Power BI has lots of self-service capabilities, that data warehouse is always created by IT. It's created by data engineers and other professional developers, and they're typically created using these highly specialized, complicated tools like SQL Server integration services or Azure Data Factory or Informatica. ETL tools are very complicated and difficult to use well for less technical users. By applying the familiarity and ease of use of Power Query, this data warehousing component in our end-to-end flow, not only do we have the technology, but we're making it readily addressable and accessible to users that previously would need to do one of two things. And this is really key. The first thing that the business users need to do today is wait until IT updates the data warehouse. So, please add this attribute to my dimension. Please add these facts. Please add a new dimension table. And the self-service process is stalled. The other thing, which is, in my experience, more common, is the business users say, I can't wait for IT, so I'm going to pull this data from the data warehouse that IT has created, and I'm going to pull this other data from these other new systems. And because they're bypassing the data warehousing layer of the BI stack, they're reintroducing the problems about consistency and cleansing and standardization. All the problems that the data warehouse solves are coming back in through that self-service path. And it's usually the impact is low, but by having those users be able to load that data into the data warehouse, on their own schedule, to have multiple passes across it, it just applies much better to the best practices that as an industry we've learned over the past 20 or 30 years.
Correct. That's a great explanation. And one other things which is, I think, great about Dataflow is that it makes that experience much simpler. Instead of me creating my own Azure Data Lake, let's say stores and things like that, it will just create all these behind the scene, which is much simpler for a user.
Yes, and the integration with Azure is one of the other true strengths of Dataflow as a capability in Power BI. So the default configuration is that the Azure storage under the hood is fully managed by the Power BI service. So there's nothing more to purchase. There's no subscription to manage. There's nothing that you need to do, and the Power BI service will automatically write to the Azure storage and then read from the Azure storage as well. And even though Azure Data Lake Store is powering it, the users never need to know. But there are additional scenarios where organizations can bring their existing Azure Data Lake storage resources. So if you have an Azure tenant with a subscription and a resource for Data Lake, you can bring that into Power BI so that when Power BI is writing the Dataflow data into Data Lake storage, it's now in a location in your Azure storage so that you as an organization can control access to it. And this allows you to have readers outside of Power BI so that any service that knows how to read CSV files and JSON files from Azure can read this data even though the data is being produced by Power BI. There are additional scenarios. So there's also ways where you can have your Azure services, like, think about the output of a Databricks job or a machine learning job writing into this CDM folder format, and I'll circle back around to that in a second, but any service or application that can write to Azure storage can write into this format because it's essentially just CSV and JSON. And that data produced by an external application can then be mounted as what's known as an external data flow or external data flow entities into Power BI. So even though the data is not being produced by Power BI, because we have Azure as our underlying storage platform, and because we're using this simple format for serializing and persisting the data, any application can write to it, and then Power BI can read from it and expose it to users just like any other data flow. So first class, read-only, but reusable data inside of the Power BI service.
That's interesting. So that is called like external data flows that are not generated from Power BI, but it is outside. It is producing the same format output.
That's correct. And those external data flows, they're really made possible by the concept that I mentioned earlier, which is the CDM folder. CDM stands for Common Data Model. And the CDM folder, and I apologize for the noise in the background here. We're at a conference, so there's bound to be a little bit
perfect.
of
The sound is perfect.
Little bit of background. So the Common Data Model folder structure essentially creates a file system folder in Azure Data Lake Storage for each entity that you create in Power BI or that you're exposing into Power BI in the other direction. But you've got one folder per entity, and inside the folder there is a collection of CSV files. So the underlying data storage is always in CSV, and the number of files will depend on partitioning and your refresh schedulers. It's if you use incremental refresh, each partition will have its own CSV file. For simpler entities, it may just be one CSV file per data flow entity. But then you have a JSON file that contains the metadata that says this entity has this name, these columns with these names and these data types, and these are the files that represent it. So it's very simple, but also very self-describing. And a key part of it is the ability to say, this entity gets its data from this Power Query query. So if we go back to that original question, is this just Power Query in the cloud? Every entity has exactly, and let me stress here, what we're talking about is the Power BI managed entities where Power BI is writing the data. So each one of these entities has exactly one way that it can be populated, and that is by the execution of this query. So if you attended or saw Amir Nets talk about data flows and he's saying, oh, data flows are like, data flows are to ETL what Excel was to programming, and he has this great concept, and I never would have thought of this myself, but it totally resonates. So back in the day, so Amir and I are around the same age, so I remember in the day when every variable in my programming environment was a global variable. There was no such thing as a non-global scope. And when that was the case, as a programmer, you had to be very, very careful during design, during development, and during testing to not write to the wrong variable from the wrong place, because this would introduce these really difficult to diagnose and difficult to solve logic errors into your code. It was like the worst thing. And modern development environments, .NET or Java or whatever, obviously have, much more granular scope and lots of control to make it hard to make those errors. But data warehousing today is essentially like programming was 40 years ago. So if you think about a table in a database, where does that data come from? So who can write to that table? And in any non-trivial situation, so any real enterprise data warehouse, there's one of two answers. And the most common answer is any application could write to it, but we think that only these applications can. So you're kind of hoping that nobody is improperly writing to it. The second one is, I've gone to great lengths to lock things down through my design and my architecture and my security and my auditing, and I hope no one else is writing to it. So there's not really any way to be 100% certain around the lineage of the data in a table. And this is why data lineage and impact analysis it's such a hard nut to crack. It's a very difficult problem to solve consistently. And Dataflows and the entities in Dataflows and Power BI are taking a much different approach by saying, rather than letting anybody write to the table, to the entity, and then we'll do our best to figure out where it came from, each entity is self-describing in saying, this query, when executed, populates the entity, and there's no other way that the data can get into it. That and the fact that these entities are all managed by the Power BI service allows Power BI to have authoritative metadata and lineage about the data that's in these entities. So, the Excel side of things is really neat because it's kind of like a function in an Excel formula. But for me, the really exciting thing is just that there's this authoritative statement about where the data came from, which is finally allowing the data warehousing pattern to catch up to the programming world. So you don't need to accept the fact that your tables are global variables anymore.
Great. Thank you. And from your explanation, I got two more questions to go. One is a little bit internals of Dataflow. Can we see the actual CSV files or those CDM folders in Azure, in our Azure account? If yes, where we can see that?
So yes, you can, but only if you're using your own Azure storage. So if you use the default configuration where you're allowing the Power BI service to manage the Azure storage for you and you're not using your own Azure subscription, in that case, we are not exposing the data to you directly. In that situation, Power BI is the only writer and Power BI is the only reader. But if you have if you are using that bring your own storage account story is the term that we'll likely be using. If you do use your own storage account, then you will have full access to the data to read it from there while Power BI is writing to it. And I know that as an MVP, you may have seen this already, and for everybody who's watching the interview after the fact, this will be part of our initial documentation when we move into public preview. But we're preparing to release a white paper on Power BI data flows, talking about the capability and the problems it solves and how it's designed and how to use it and so on. And that white paper, at least in its current draft, includes details about the CDM folders, and it has screenshots and so on. So if you are a Power BI user, but you don't currently have your own Azure subscription with Azure Data Lake storage, you'll still be able to get the information and the visual there.
Awesome. Thank you. Great response. So based on that, if I use my own Azure Data Lake storage, I can see how the structure of files is, and then I can use, let's say, Azure Data Factory or SSIS to produce the same thing, and that would be like my external data flow, which I can then leverage it in Power BI. That's great.
That is absolutely correct.
The second question comes after this is about licensing. So if I use my own Azure Data Lake, obviously I should pay for that. But if I use the built-in within Dataflow of Power BI, is it all included in my Power BI $10 per user pro account?
It absolutely is. So a key thing to keep in mind, this is the question that I keep answering because people just it sounds too good to be true. This is a new capability coming to Power BI. So we don't charge you extra for reports. We don't charge you extra for dashboards or for data sets. A data flow is simply a new capability in Power BI. It's a new object type inside your Power BI workspace. And if you think about what you get for that $10 per month pro license, one part of it is a 10 gigabyte per user storage quota, right? So you get 10 gigabytes of data in the service. That 10 gigabytes can now be used by your data sets or your data flow entities. Similarly, if you are a Power BI premium customer, and you have that dedicated premium capacity, that 100 terabytes per capacity node can also be used for the data flow storage. So it's simply another way to use the capabilities or the resources, the quota that Power BI is already giving you.
Right. That's perfect. Thank you. That was a super explanation.
So thank you. And let me mention one thing as well. So
sure.
Even though I don't know the final details here, I should also mention that similar to other parts of Power BI, there will be some capabilities that are only included for Power BI Premium. Incremental refresh is likely to be one of them. So for just be aware that as you're seeing the Power BI data flow demos over the next days and weeks, some of the things that we show may only be available in workspaces that are backed by premium capacity.
Yeah, that makes sense, of course. Anything else you would like to mention?
So I'm not sure when this video will go live. So
hopefully this afternoon.
Woo! Okay, so if it's going live this afternoon, it's currently Tuesday, Wednesday afternoon at 3:15 Orlando time. Miguel Lopez from the Power Query team and I will be delivering a 45-minute breakout session on data flows. So if this interview has piqued your interest, even though there will be a lot of the same information. We will have slides, we will have demos, we'll have a more structured format, and it will be live streamed and it will be available for on-demand viewing afterwards. So this is, in my opinion, the most exciting thing that has come to Power BI since Power BI in its current state has launched. It's really going to enable a truly exciting and truly game-changing set of capabilities for your Power BI users, both IT and business. And I can't wait to hear what people think, and I can't wait to hear the questions that come out of the breakout session. So please attend, even if you're not here in Orlando, and either find me on Twitter and send me questions, or send me questions via the tech community site, which is where the session will be live streamed.
Awesome. Thank you. We will also put your LinkedIn, Twitter links for people who want to connect with you as well. It was a pleasure to talk with you, and thank you for giving us your valuable time through the very busy Ignite.
Well, thank you very much, and hopefully next time around we'll be able to do this in person.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. Thanks very much,
Thank
Reza.
you. Bye.
Bye-bye.